I woke up choking on nothing. That was the first thing my mind could register. Not pain, not fear, nothing. My chest rose, but no air followed. The steady, mechanical rhythm I had come to rely on every night was gone. No soft hum. No gentle push of breath filling my lungs. Just silence so complete it felt intentional. I reached out blindly, fingers trembling, searching for the ventilator tubing at my side. My hand brushed the smooth plastic casing, then the control panel. The screen was dark, powered off. My heart slammed against my ribs. I tried to inhale again, harder this time, and felt the familiar burn spread through my chest. The room felt smaller, the ceiling pressing down as black dots crept into my vision. I opened my mouth to call out, but no sound came. My throat refused to cooperate. That was when I heard it. Footsteps, soft, measured, not rushing. They stopped just outside my bedroom door. I could make out a shape in the darkness, someone standing there, close enough that I could sense them. They didn't turn on the light. They didn't say my name. They didn't move toward me. They just stood there, watching. In that suspended moment, gasping for air, it became painfully clear that the most terrifying part wasn't the machine being off. It was knowing that someone had chosen for it to be silent. By the time I managed to fumble the power button and force the ventilator back on, my whole body was shaking. The machine whirred to life, breath returning in uneven waves, but the damage was already done. I lay there afterward, staring at the ceiling, listening for footsteps that never came back. No one checked on me. No one asked if I was okay. Morning arrived like any other. Sunlight filtered through the kitchen windows. Coffee brewed. Plates clinked. The television murmured in the background. When I finally made it out of my room, weak and exhausted, no one looked up with concern. My mother asked if I wanted toast. My father commented on the weather. No one mentioned the night before. I had been recovering from severe respiratory complications for months. The doctors were clear. I needed a ventilator at night to maintain stable breathing. Missing even a short window of assisted airflow could be dangerous. That was why I was staying at my parents' house, despite my age, despite my independence. I wasn't supposed to be alone. The machine sat beside my bed like a lifeline, and apparently like an inconvenience. The noise had always bothered my sister. She never hid that. She said it disrupted her sleep, that it made the house feel like a hospital. She joked more than once that I was being dramatic, that I leaned into being sick because it earned sympathy. Overreacting, she called it. Attention-seeking. I watched her that morning as she scrolled through her phone, completely unbothered. She didn't meet my eyes. She didn't ask how I slept. When I finally spoke, my voice was quiet. I asked if anyone had noticed the ventilator was off during the night. My mother frowned slightly and said maybe it malfunctioned. My father shrugged and suggested I might have turned it off in my sleep. My sister sighed loudly and said I scared everyone for no reason. "See," she said, "you're fine." The word accident was introduced gently, then repeated until it stuck. A simple accident, nothing to worry about, no need to call the doctor, no need to make a big deal out of it. No apology followed. As the conversation drifted on, it subtly shifted. The focus moved away from the machine and onto me. How stressed I'd been lately. How sensitive I'd become. How difficult it was to know what I really needed. I felt myself shrinking in my chair, my own memory starting to blur under the weight of their certainty. Had I imagined the footsteps? Had panic exaggerated everything? But the image of that dark doorway stayed sharp in my mind. Later that day, I returned to my room and sat on the edge of the bed staring at the ventilator. I checked the cords. The outlet. Everything was secure. There was no sign of a malfunction. I knew how this machine worked. It didn't turn itself off. If I hadn't woken up when I did, if my fingers hadn't found that button in time, there wouldn't have been a breakfast conversation. There would have been sirens. Or worse, explanations. And I understood something then, with a clarity that made my stomach drop. The danger wasn't my illness. It was living in a house where my survival was considered optional, and where the story of what happened could be rewritten so easily that even I was expected to doubt myself. By the next morning, the house had decided what happened to me. I woke up with my chest still aching, my throat raw as if I had swallowed sand. My head felt heavy, stuffed with cotton. I lay there for a few minutes, listening to the familiar sounds of the house waking up: cabinet doors, running water, the low murmur of the television. Everything sounded normal. Too normal. When I finally dragged myself into the kitchen, no one looked alarmed. My mother was buttering toast. My father sat at the table reading the news on his tablet. My sister leaned against the counter, scrolling on her phone, one leg crossed casually over the other. No one asked how I slept. My mother glanced up briefly and asked if I wanted coffee. Her tone was gentle, almost cheerful, as if the night before hadn't nearly taken my breath away. I shook my head and sat down slowly, my body still weak. I waited. Surely someone would bring it up. Surely someone would say something. Nothing. After a moment, I cleared my throat. The ventilator was off last night. The room didn't freeze. There was no dramatic pause. That was the strangest part. Instead, my mother frowned slightly, like I'd mentioned a minor inconvenience. "Oh," she said. "Maybe it glitched." My father didn't look up. "Those machines aren't perfect," he said. "You probably shifted in your sleep." I felt my stomach tighten. "It doesn't work like that," I said quietly. "It was powered off." My sister finally looked up from her phone and sighed, loud enough to make her point. "You're breathing, aren't you?" The words landed heavier than she probably intended, or maybe exactly as she intended. She set her phone down and crossed her arms, her expression somewhere between irritation and boredom. "You scared everyone for no reason," she continued. "You really need to stop jumping to conclusions." Scared everyone. I looked around the table. No one looked scared. No one looked concerned. They looked mildly inconvenienced, as if I'd disrupted the flow of breakfast with something unpleasant. My mother reached for her mug. "Let's not make a big deal out of it," she said. "You've been under a lot of stress." That was when the word accident appeared. "It was probably just an accident," my father said. "These things happen." Accident. The word settled into the room, soft and comforting, like a blanket being pulled over something ugly. My sister nodded eagerly. "Exactly," she said. "An accident. You're always assuming the worst." No one asked who might have been awake. No one asked who had walked past my room during the night. No one suggested checking the machine, calling the medical supplier, or contacting my doctor. The conversation simply moved on, as if the explanation had already been agreed upon somewhere I hadn't been invited. I felt myself growing smaller with every sentence. As they talked, the focus shifted almost seamlessly from the ventilator to me. My sensitivity, my anxiety, how I'd been on edge ever since I got sick. My sister mentioned, half joking, that I tended to spiral when things didn't go perfectly. "You've always been like this," she said. "You fixate." I stared down at my hands resting in my lap, trying to hold on to what I knew I had experienced: the dark room, the dead machine, the shape in the doorway. But surrounded by their certainty, my own memory started to feel fragile, like something that could crack if I pressed too hard. Maybe I had panicked. Maybe fear had filled in gaps that weren't really there. That thought scared me almost as much as the night before. Later, I heard my mother on the phone in the living room. She wasn't whispering. She didn't think she needed to. "She had a rough night," she said. "The machine shut off, but she's okay. You know how she gets when she's sick." I stood in the hallway, listening, my chest tight for an entirely different reason. The story was already traveling, already smoothing itself out, already shaping me into the problem. By the afternoon, the narrative had settled completely. It had edges now, polished and repeatable. A small incident, an overreaction, a misunderstanding fueled by anxiety. My sister repeated it effortlessly when a relative stopped by. She thought something happened with her machine, she said, rolling her eyes just slightly. She's fine. I watched them talk about me as if I weren't sitting right there. No one apologized. No one checked the ventilator. No one asked me to describe what I'd felt or seen. The lack of follow-up was loud, even if their voices were calm. That evening, alone in my room, I sat on the edge of the bed and stared at the machine. I ran my fingers along the cords, the outlet, the switch. Everything was secure. Everything was exactly as it should be. I knew then that if I spoke up again, if I pushed back, I would only be confirming what they already believed, that I was unstable, dramatic, unreliable. I could feel the label forming, settling over me like a shadow. So I stopped talking. Not because I agreed with them, not because I believed their version, but because I needed to see how far they were willing to take it once they thought I'd accepted their story. After that morning, I stopped feeling like I lived in a house. I felt like I lived inside a condition. Every night before I lay down, I checked the ventilator, not once, but twice. I traced the cord from the machine to the wall, pressed the plug firmly into the outlet, tested the power button, and watched the screen light up before I allowed myself to sit on the bed. Even then, sleep came in shallow waves. I never fully relaxed. I listened for changes in the sound of the machine the way other people listen for smoke alarms. The house didn't feel hostile. That was the problem. It felt polite, quiet, controlled. During the day, nothing openly wrong happened. No one yelled, no one threatened me. But small things kept shifting, just enough to keep me off balance. My evening medication wasn't where I had left it. When I asked, my mother said she'd moved it to a safer spot. The door to my room was closed when I distinctly remembered leaving it open for airflow. One afternoon, I noticed the outlet behind my nightstand felt loose, as if it had been tugged and pushed back in place. Each incident had a reasonable explanation. Each one could be dismissed on its own. Together, they formed a pattern I couldn't ignore. My sister never touched anything in front of me. She didn't need to. She had a way of appearing right after something was off, leaning casually against the doorframe, watching my reaction. "You really shouldn't be alone with all this," she said once, glancing at the machine beside my bed. "It's a lot for one person to manage." Her voice was calm, almost kind, but the message was clear. I wasn't in control. Someone else should be. I started paying attention to timing. When people went to bed. When lights turned off. When footsteps passed my door. I noted who stayed up late and who woke early. I memorized the rhythm of the house, because my safety depended on understanding it. At night, I slept with one hand resting near the ventilator controls. I hated myself for it, but the fear was stronger than pride. If the machine went silent again, I needed to be ready. Once, just after midnight, I woke to a faint click. Nothing shut off, nothing moved. But the sound alone was enough to send my pulse racing. I lay there, staring into the dark, counting my breaths until they evened out. In those hours, memories crept in uninvited. Not dramatic ones, not moments of cruelty that could be pointed to and named. Smaller recollections, decisions made without me, conversations that stopped when I entered the room, times when my needs were acknowledged but deprioritized, explained away as inconvenient. I remembered a family meeting years earlier, long before I got sick, where plans were finalized before I arrived. My sister had smiled then too, telling me it was nothing personal. I had believed her. Now, lying awake in the dark, I understood that nothing personal had always meant nothing negotiable. One afternoon, I overheard my sister talking to my mother in the kitchen. They didn't know I was within earshot. "She needs structure," my sister said. "Left on her own, she spirals." My mother didn't argue. That silence hurt more than agreement would have. I retreated to my room without making a sound. For the first time since the night the ventilator went silent, something inside me shifted. Not fear, focus. I stopped trying to convince anyone of anything. I stopped explaining. I stopped reacting. Instead, I watched. I watched how my sister spoke when she thought she was alone. I watched how quickly concern turned into impatience when she thought I wasn't listening. I watched the way my parents deferred to her without realizing they were doing it. I kept track of details I used to overlook. Times, phrases, habits. I noticed how my sister knew exactly when I went to bed, even on nights when I didn't announce it. I noticed how she commented on my sleep before I mentioned it. I didn't confront her. I didn't ask questions. I let her believe I was shrinking, retreating, accepting my role as the fragile one. In truth, I was learning the rules of a game I hadn't known I was playing. By the end of the week, the house felt different to me. Not safer, clearer. I understood then that this environment had never been neutral. It had always favored the loudest voice, the most confident version of events. And I understood something else, too. If I wanted to survive, not just physically, but with my dignity intact, I couldn't afford to be the person they thought I was. I couldn't be the one who reacted, who begged to be believed. I had to become the one who noticed everything and said nothing until the right moment. That was when I realized I wasn't just living in that house anymore. I was studying it. They framed it as concern. That was how the conversation began, gently, carefully, as if they were approaching something fragile that might break if handled too roughly. My mother asked me to sit at the dining table one afternoon, her voice light, almost rehearsed. My father took the chair across from me. My sister sat beside him, not too close, but close enough to feel deliberate. No one raised their voice. No one accused me of anything outright. That would have been too obvious. "We've been talking," my mother said, folding her hands together, "about what's best for you right now." The words "best for you" hovered in the air like a promise that already had conditions attached. My sister picked up where she left off. She spoke smoothly, confidently, as if she had practiced this in front of a mirror. She said things like temporary and precaution. She said no one was trying to take anything away from me. She said it was just about safety. I listened without interrupting. They talked about my health, my sleep, my anxiety. They spoke as if I weren't fully present, as if I were a subject in a case study rather than a person at the table. My sister mentioned the night the ventilator went off, carefully avoiding details, presenting it as proof that I couldn't be trusted to manage things alone. "You don't need this stress," she said. "We can handle it." I asked what exactly they meant by that. My sister hesitated for half a second before answering, and in that pause I felt the weight of something prepared. She said they had looked into options, that there were legal ways to make sure decisions were handled properly if something went wrong, that it would remove the burden from me. She said the word lawyer as if it were already familiar. My father nodded. "Just to understand what our options are," he said. Nothing formal. But something about the way he avoided my eyes told me that line had been crossed already. They slid a thin stack of papers across the table. Not a contract, they assured me, just information. I picked it up and scanned the first page. My name was already printed at the top. My full name. Correctly spelled. I felt a cold settle in my stomach. This wasn't a discussion that had just begun. It was one that had been developing quietly, without me, long before I'd been invited to the table. When I asked why I hadn't been included earlier, my sister smiled tightly and said they hadn't wanted to worry me. She said they knew how easily I became overwhelmed. The implication sat heavy between us. My reaction was the problem, not their actions. As the conversation continued, the tone shifted almost imperceptibly. The warmth thinned. The patience shortened. When I pushed back gently, asking questions instead of making accusations, my sister's voice hardened. "You're living here because you need help," she said. "We're just trying to make sure everything stays manageable." Manageable for whom went unspoken. She mentioned the possibility of court if things escalated. Not as a threat, she insisted, but as a process, a formality, something that would be easier if I cooperated. "We can do this the simple way," she said, smiling again, "or we can make it complicated." My mother didn't contradict her. My father stared at the table. I realized then that the power in the room didn't come from volume or force. It came from consensus. They didn't need to overpower me. They only needed to agree with each other. When they finally asked how I felt about everything, I chose my words carefully. I said I needed time to think. I said I wanted to understand the documents better. I didn't say no. That answer seemed to frustrate them more than outright refusal would have. The meeting ended abruptly. Chairs scraped back. The papers were gathered up and placed neatly out of reach. My sister reminded me lightly that this was all about support. I returned to my room with a steady expression, closing the door behind me and locking it for the first time since I'd moved back in. Sitting on the edge of my bed, I replayed every sentence in my head. The practiced phrases, the coordinated concern, the way my name had already been typed onto documents I hadn't agreed to see. They weren't reacting to my illness anymore. They were preparing for a future in which my voice could be officially sidelined. And for the first time, I understood the night the ventilator went silent as something more than cruelty or impatience. It had been a test, a way to see how easily my reality could be questioned, how quickly control could shift if my weakness was framed correctly. I lay back against the pillows, staring at the ceiling, listening to the ventilator hum beside me. Whatever they thought they were managing, it wasn't just my health. It was my right to decide whether I mattered. I agreed with them more than they expected. Not out loud, not in the way that would satisfy them completely, but enough to make them relax. I nodded when they spoke. I said I understood their concerns. I thanked them for looking out for me. I let my voice sound tired instead of defensive. It worked. The pressure eased almost immediately. My sister's shoulders dropped. My mother looked relieved. They stopped watching me as closely, stopped bracing for resistance. They thought they had successfully guided me back into the role they preferred. The fragile one, the grateful one, the one who wouldn't cause trouble. What they didn't know was that my silence wasn't surrender. It was space. That night, after the house settled into sleep, I sat on the edge of my bed and looked at the ventilator again. I didn't do it out of fear this time. I did it out of curiosity. I turned the machine off and on, slowly, deliberately, paying attention to every step it required to power down completely. It took intention. You couldn't brush against a button by accident. You couldn't trigger it in your sleep. You had to hold the control, wait for the confirmation, override the alert. The machine was designed to resist sudden shutdowns for exactly the reason I depended on it. When I finished, I sat back, my hands steady. The word accident no longer applied. The next day, a visiting respiratory technician arrived to check on my equipment. My mother had scheduled it without telling me, framing it as routine maintenance. I stayed quiet while he worked, answering questions when asked, watching carefully. At one point, he frowned at the control panel and asked when the last manual shutdown had occurred. He said it casually, like it was nothing. I told him the date. He paused, then nodded. "That makes sense," he said. "Someone powered it down properly." Someone. He didn't look suspicious. He didn't look alarmed. To him, it was simply a fact. But to me, it was the first confirmation from outside this house that what I remembered wasn't a distortion. After he left, I went back to my room and pulled out every piece of paperwork I could find. Medical summaries, instruction manuals, discharge notes. I photographed pages with my phone and backed them up to a cloud account my family didn't know about. I wrote down dates, times, names. I didn't tell anyone what I was doing. Later that week, a home health nurse stopped by to check my vitals. She had a calm presence, the kind that made people talk without realizing it. As she packed up her equipment, she asked casually how things were going at home. I hesitated, then answered honestly, but selectively. I told her about the night the ventilator was off. I didn't assign blame. I didn't mention my sister. I just stated the facts. She didn't react the way my family had. Her expression tightened slightly. She asked a few specific questions: where the machine was placed, who else was home, whether there had been any follow-up documentation. "Machines like that don't shut themselves down," she said quietly. I nodded. That's what I thought. She wrote something in her notes. Not dramatically, not urgently, just enough to matter. From that moment on, I became careful in a new way. I logged when people were home. I saved text messages that mentioned my sleep or my schedule. I noticed how often my sister referenced things she shouldn't have known unless she was paying attention when she thought I wasn't. I let her keep believing I was distracted, overwhelmed, compliant. Inside, something had shifted. Fear had been replaced by clarity. I knew now that if I spoke too soon, everything I had would disappear. The story would adapt. The concern would sharpen into justification. They would move faster, close ranks tighter. So I waited. I waited while my sister spoke confidently about what was best for me. I waited while my parents deferred to her judgment without realizing they were doing it. I waited while paperwork quietly accumulated in places I wasn't meant to see. I didn't confront, I didn't accuse, I didn't demand answers. I prepared. Because for the first time since the machine had gone silent, I understood something vital. I wasn't powerless. I was underestimated. And as long as they believed that, they would keep revealing exactly how far they were willing to go. They chose the timing carefully. It was late afternoon when my energy dipped and my breathing felt heavier than usual. My mother asked me to come to the dining room, her voice gentle, almost apologetic, as if she already knew this would be hard for me. When I arrived, everyone was there. Chairs were arranged. Papers lay stacked neatly at the center of the table. It wasn't a family gathering. It was a meeting. I sat where they indicated, the seat closest to the end of the table, slightly apart. My father cleared his throat but didn't speak. My sister did. She always did. She started by thanking me for being open lately, for being cooperative, for understanding how stressful things had been for everyone. The words sounded kind, but they landed like a ledger, as if my compliance had already been counted and tallied. "We just want to make sure nothing falls through the cracks," she said, "especially with court coming up." Court. The word dropped into the room with deliberate casualness, like it had already been discussed enough times to lose its weight. I felt my stomach tighten, but I kept my face neutral. My mother nodded. "It's better if we're prepared," she added, "for your sake." They spoke in unison without realizing it, repeating the same phrases in slightly different tones. Safety, stability, responsibility. No one asked what I wanted. No one paused to see if I understood. My sister slid a folder toward me, stopping just short of my reach. "This is what the lawyer recommended," she said. "Standard stuff." I didn't touch it. She explained the contents before I could open it, summarizing in a way that made everything sound temporary and reversible. Emergency decision-making. Limited authority. A safeguard, just in case. She spoke as if these were natural extensions of love, not legal mechanisms designed to override me. "You wouldn't have to do anything," she said. "We'd handle it." I asked when they had spoken to a lawyer. There was a fraction of a pause. My sister recovered quickly, but it was there. She said they'd only consulted someone recently after the incident with the ventilator when they realized how serious things could become. I remembered the date on the technician's log. The consultation had happened before that night. I said nothing. As the conversation continued, the temperature shifted. The patience thinned. When I asked what would happen if I didn't agree, my sister's smile tightened. "Then the court decides," she said. "And that's usually messier." Messier for whom, she didn't specify. My father finally spoke then, his voice low. He said they didn't want this to turn into a fight. That cooperation would make everything smoother. That I should think about how much they were already doing for me. I understood the message. Gratitude was expected. Resistance would be framed as instability. My sister leaned forward slightly, lowering her voice as if sharing a secret. "We can do this the easy way," she said, "or we can let professionals handle it." I noticed then how specific she was, how confident. She mentioned timelines, procedures, even the name of the judge assigned to similar cases. Details I hadn't been given. She knew more than she should have. At one point, while explaining the night the ventilator was turned off, she made a mistake. A small one. She referred to the time it happened, narrowing the window more precisely than anyone else had. No one had said that out loud before. The room went quiet. My father coughed and interrupted her, redirecting the conversation back to the paperwork. My sister didn't apologize. She didn't need to. But she stopped speaking for a moment, her eyes flicking toward me, measuring. I didn't react. That seemed to unsettle her more than anger would have. Finally, the folder was pushed fully in front of me. A pen followed. "Just sign that you've reviewed it," my mother said. "We're not asking you to agree yet." I picked up the pen, then set it down. "I need more time," I said evenly, "and I want my own advice before I sign anything." The change was immediate. My sister's expression hardened. The warmth drained from the room. My father stared at the table again, as if willing it to resolve things for him. "This is exactly what we're talking about," my sister said. "You make things harder than they need to be." I met her gaze for the first time in the entire meeting. "I'm allowed to understand what I'm being asked to give up." No one argued with that statement. They didn't have to. The meeting ended quickly after that, chairs scraping back, papers gathered with sharp efficiency. My sister reminded me, one last time, that everything they were doing was for my benefit. When I returned to my room, I closed the door and locked it, my hands shaking only after the latch clicked into place. I sat on the bed and stared at the ventilator, listening to its steady hum. In that meeting, something had become unmistakably clear. I wasn't a person they were protecting anymore. I was a variable they needed to control. And the moment I refused to make it easy, I became a problem they were prepared to solve. The courthouse smelled like paper, disinfectant, and something metallic I couldn't name. I arrived early, not because I wanted to, but because my sister insisted it would look better if we were all there on time. She walked a step ahead of me through the security checkpoint, confident, familiar with the process. My parents followed behind us, quiet, their faces set in an expression I had learned to recognize as concern mixed with resignation. Inside the hearing room, everything felt too bright. The lights were harsh, flattening everyone into pale versions of themselves. My sister chose a seat near the front, close to her attorney. My parents sat beside her. I was directed to a chair slightly apart, just far enough to be symbolic. No one sat next to me. I folded my hands in my lap and focused on my breathing. The ventilator wasn't here, of course, but the memory of its rhythm stayed with me, a quiet metronome keeping me grounded. I reminded myself that I was allowed to be here, that my presence was not a courtesy. When the judge entered, the room stood, then settled again. Formalities followed. Names were read. The case was outlined in neutral language that stripped months of fear and manipulation down to a few clinical phrases. Then my sister's lawyer began to speak. He talked about love first, about family responsibility, about how difficult it was to watch someone struggle and not know how best to help them. He painted a careful picture of concern, using words like vulnerable and unstable, wrapping them in sympathy so they sounded almost gentle. He mentioned my health repeatedly, my recent illness, my reliance on medical equipment. He suggested that these factors made it hard for me to make clear decisions under stress. I listened without reacting. The night the ventilator went silent was described as a misunderstanding. A frightening moment, yes, but one that revealed how fragile my situation really was. He implied that my perception of events might not be reliable given the circumstances. I stared straight ahead, my jaw tight, but my expression calm. When it was my turn to speak, the judge asked me a few simple questions. My name, my understanding of the proceedings, whether I felt safe in my current living arrangement. I answered plainly. I didn't elaborate, I didn't tell the story of the night, I didn't mention the footsteps or the dark doorway or the machine powered off with intention. I could feel my sister watching me from the corner of my eye, waiting for something emotional, something that would confirm her narrative. I gave her nothing. The judge nodded and made a note. Silence followed, heavier than any argument. As the hearing continued, the imbalance became obvious. My sister's side had prepared statements, documents, language refined by legal counsel. I had the truth, unadorned and still waiting for its moment. At one point, my sister leaned over and whispered something to her lawyer. They both glanced in my direction, their expressions tight but controlled. I wondered what they saw when they looked at me. Someone weak, someone already halfway erased. During a brief recess, everyone stood. My parents spoke quietly with my sister, forming a small, closed circle. No one approached me. No one asked if I needed water or a moment to rest. I sat alone and stared at the empty witness chair across the room. For the first time, doubt flickered. Not about what had happened, but about whether it would matter. I had done everything right. I had stayed calm. I had followed advice. And still, the weight of their version pressed down on me. Maybe this was how it ended. Not with confrontation, but with quiet agreement that I was less capable than they were. When the judge returned, the room settled again. He shuffled papers, scanning the file in front of him. His expression was neutral, unreadable. Then he asked a question that shifted the air. He requested clarification about the ventilator incident. Not in emotional terms, but technical ones. He asked whether any external review had been conducted. My sister's lawyer answered smoothly, saying no formal investigation had been necessary, that the family had handled it internally. The judge paused, then nodded slowly. He said there was an additional witness to be heard before any decision would be made. I felt my pulse quicken. My sister straightened in her chair. Her lawyer frowned slightly. My parents exchanged a look. A name was called. It wasn't one I had heard spoken in this room before. As the witness prepared to enter, I realized something important. Everything up to this point had been about stories. Who told them best, who sounded most reasonable, who appeared most stable. But stories had limits, and somewhere beyond this room, beyond my family's carefully curated concern, the facts had been waiting patiently. I sat back in my chair, my hands still folded, my expression unchanged. For the first time since this process began, the silence didn't feel like weakness. It felt like restraint. And I understood then that I hadn't come here to convince anyone. I had come here to let the truth arrive on its own terms. The name sounded unfamiliar in the room, and that alone was enough to shift the balance. A woman entered through the side door, her posture straight, her expression composed. She wore scrubs under a cardigan, hands clasped loosely in front of her as she approached the witness chair. She didn't look at my sister. She didn't look at my parents. Her eyes flicked toward me for half a second. Not with sympathy, but recognition. The oath was administered. She sat down. The judge asked her to state her name and occupation. She answered clearly. Night shift nurse. Assigned to my case during my hospital discharge and subsequent home care coordination. Her voice was steady, professional, uninvested in drama. Then the questions began. She explained her role plainly. She monitored post-discharge compliance, equipment usage, and incident reports related to patients who required assisted breathing devices at home. My name appeared on her list because of an irregularity flagged in the system. That was the word she used. Irregularity. She was asked to elaborate. She explained that ventilators like mine were designed with multiple safeguards. They did not power off silently. They did not shut down without a deliberate sequence of actions. Even a malfunction would trigger alarms, alerts, records. There was no malfunction recorded, she said calmly. The room felt very still. She described reviewing the device logs after the reported incident. She confirmed the time the machine was turned off. She confirmed it was powered down manually. She confirmed that the shutdown sequence had been completed fully, not interrupted. Someone had known exactly what they were doing. My sister's lawyer shifted in his seat. The judge asked if it was possible the patient could have done it herself. The nurse shook her head. Given the patient's condition and the timing, it would have been extremely unlikely. The sequence requires sustained interaction. It's not something that happens accidentally. The word accident dissolved quietly. She was asked where the device was located at the time. She confirmed it had been stationed in a private residence. She was asked who else had access to the room. She answered carefully. According to the intake forms, the patient was not living alone. My sister stared straight ahead. The nurse continued, explaining that after reviewing the logs, she had filed an incident report, as protocol required. Hospital records, shift notes, documentation time-stamped and verified. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. The facts spoke for her. When my sister's lawyer attempted to redirect, suggesting stress or confusion, the nurse corrected him gently. She explained that respiratory distress could impair memory, yes, but the device logs were objective. They didn't misremember. They didn't exaggerate. They recorded. The judge asked one final question: whether the timing of the manual shutdown aligned with a period when someone else was known to be present in the home. Yes, the nurse said, it does. There were no gasps, no outbursts, no sudden confessions. There was only silence. I felt it settle across the room, heavy and undeniable. My parents didn't look at each other. My father's hands were clenched on the table. My mother stared at a spot just past the judge's shoulder, her expression unreadable. My sister's face had changed. Not dramatically. Not enough for anyone to point to and say she looked guilty. But the ease was gone. The certainty. Her jaw was tight, her posture rigid, as if holding herself in place took effort now. The judge thanked the nurse and dismissed her. She stood, nodded once, and left the room without a glance back. In her absence, the air felt different, thinner, sharper. The judge addressed the room again, summarizing what had been entered into the record: intentional interference, life support equipment, dependency, risk. Each phrase landed with measured precision. No accusations were made, no names were spoken, they didn't need to be. My sister's lawyer asked for a brief recess. The judge granted it. As people stood, my parents remained seated. My sister leaned forward, hands pressed flat against the table, staring at nothing. For the first time since this began, no one reached for me. No one whispered reassurances or warnings. I sat quietly, my heart beating steadily, my breathing even. I realized then that my silence had changed meaning. Earlier, it had made me seem small, passive, vulnerable. Now it framed everything that followed. I hadn't had to tell the story of that night. I hadn't had to convince anyone of what I felt or feared. The machine had spoken, the records had spoken. Someone outside this family, with no stake in our dynamics, had spoken. And the truth had entered the room without my voice at all. When the judge returned and called the hearing back to order, I didn't straighten in my seat. I didn't prepare myself to speak. I didn't need to. Whatever came next, the ground beneath my sister's certainty had already cracked. And for the first time since the ventilator went silent, I knew that no one could turn the air off again. The questions changed after that. They were no longer about my anxiety, my health, or whether I was capable of managing my own life. The judge leaned back slightly, fingers steepled, and looked down at the file as if seeing it for the first time. "Who benefits?" he asked calmly, "if she's declared incapable?" No one answered right away. My sister's lawyer started to speak, then stopped. The pause was brief, but it was enough. The judge looked up again, his gaze steady, patient, waiting. That was when the timeline began to unravel. Documents were referenced that hadn't been emphasized before. Dates, consultations, emails. The nurse's testimony had opened a door, and now the questions moved through it with purpose. The judge asked when legal advice had first been sought regarding my medical decision-making authority. My sister's lawyer answered, citing a date that sounded reasonable, cautious. The judge compared it to another document in the file, the consultation request. It was time-stamped earlier, days earlier. Before the night my ventilator was turned off. The room tightened, my sister shifted in her chair, not dramatically, just enough to draw attention. The judge noticed. "So the concern wasn't triggered by the incident," he said. "It preceded it." My sister's lawyer attempted to explain. He said families often explore options proactively. He said it was common to prepare for worst-case scenarios. The judge nodded, then asked another question. What assets would be affected if the patient were deemed unable to make decisions independently? This time, the answer couldn't be softened. There were references to long-term plans, to property management, to authority over finances tied to medical decisions, not an inheritance in the distant sense, but control in the immediate one, the ability to sign, approve, redirect. The benefit wasn't abstract, it was specific. My sister was asked to respond directly. She stood, smoothing her jacket, her expression carefully composed. She said everything she'd said before, that she loved me, that she was only trying to help, that she had no interest in controlling anything. The judge listened, then asked her to clarify a discrepancy, a financial detail she had previously denied knowing, a plan she had claimed not to be involved in. Her answer came too quickly. Then she corrected herself. The shift was subtle, but it was there. The polished concern cracked just enough to reveal irritation underneath. She spoke faster now, her words sharper, defensive. "I've done everything for her," she said. "I put my life on hold." The sentence hung in the air, heavy with something that wasn't love. I stayed seated. I didn't look at her. I didn't need to. The judge thanked her and asked her to sit. He turned his attention back to the record, summarizing what had been established. The ventilator shutdown, the prior legal consultation, the overlap of timelines, the potential gain. He spoke without emotion, without judgment in his tone. Just clarity. "This was not an accident," he said, "and it was not a misunderstanding." No one interrupted. He continued carefully, deliberately. The interference with life support equipment had occurred while I was dependent on it to breathe. The act required manual intervention. The timing aligned with a period when another party was present and had motive. Intentional interference. The phrase was entered into the record. I felt something shift inside me then, not relief exactly, but release. The weight I'd been carrying, the need to explain, to justify, to defend my memory, lifted quietly. The truth had moved from my body into the room. It no longer needed me to hold it up. The judge outlined the consequences. My sister's request for expanded authority was denied. Her involvement in my medical decision-making was terminated effective immediately. All healthcare decisions would be transferred to a neutral, court-appointed representative until I chose otherwise. He noted that existing arrangements regarding property and estate planning remained unchanged. The will stood as it was. There was no reaction from my sister this time, no argument, no protest. She stared straight ahead, her face unreadable, as if the room had gone slightly out of focus. My parents didn't speak. They didn't look at me. They looked smaller somehow, folded inward by the realization that the story they had accepted so easily had consequences they couldn't undo. The judge concluded the hearing and rose. The room stood again, then slowly emptied. I remained seated for a moment, my hands resting calmly in my lap. My breathing was steady. My chest felt light, not because the danger had passed entirely, but because it had finally been named. As people filed out, my sister passed me without a word. She didn't glare. She didn't apologize. She didn't acknowledge me at all. And that was fine. I didn't need her to say anything anymore. The truth had spoken in a language she couldn't control, and for the first time, it had taken something from her instead of from me. When I finally stood and walked toward the exit, the air felt different. Not triumphant, not dramatic, just clear. And I knew then that whatever came next, no one in that family would ever be able to claim they were acting in my best interest again without remembering what it had cost them to try. The hearing ended without drama. There were no raised voices, no tears, no last-minute pleas. The judge stood, the clerk gathered files, and people began to move as if this were any other administrative conclusion. Chairs scraped softly against the floor. Papers were tucked into briefcases. The room emptied in an orderly way that felt almost insulting after everything that had been exposed. I stayed seated until most of them had gone. When I finally stood, my legs felt steady. That surprised me. I had imagined weakness, the delayed crash of adrenaline. But instead there was a quiet sense of balance, as if something heavy had been set down inside me. Outside the courtroom, the hallway buzzed with low conversation. Lawyers spoke in hushed, efficient tones. My parents walked a few steps ahead of me, not together, not apart, just loosely aligned by habit. My sister followed behind them. She didn't look at me. No one spoke to me. That was the first consequence. In the days that followed, the changes came quickly, but without spectacle. A court-appointed healthcare advocate contacted me directly, introducing herself and explaining the transition process. She spoke to me as if my competence were a given, not a question to be tested. She asked what I wanted, how I preferred decisions to be handled, who I trusted. It felt unfamiliar, being addressed without translation. My sister was removed from every chain of communication involving my care. Her name disappeared from forms. Her signature authority was revoked. She was no longer copied on emails or notified of appointments. The system adjusted smoothly, impersonally, as if correcting an error that should never have existed. No announcement was made to the family. There didn't need to be one. At home, the shift was palpable. Conversations became shorter, more cautious. My parents no longer spoke over me or around me. They asked instead of assumed. When they didn't know something, they waited for an answer rather than filling the silence themselves. No one apologized, but no one questioned me either. My sister avoided shared spaces. When we crossed paths, she kept her eyes down or fixed straight ahead, her presence clipped and contained. The confidence that once filled every room she entered was gone, replaced by something brittle and watchful. She hadn't lost everything, but she had lost control. That loss echoed outward in small, unmistakable ways. She was no longer invited into private discussions. When mail arrived addressed to me, it was placed on the table without being opened. When phone calls came for me, they were handed over without comment. The house adjusted around a new center of gravity. One evening, as I sat in the living room reading, my mother hesitated in the doorway. She asked carefully if I wanted help setting up my medication for the night. I looked up and said, "No, thank you." She nodded and left the room without argument. That was another consequence. It wasn't triumph I felt as the days passed. It was space. The kind that allows you to breathe without measuring each inhale. The kind that exists when no one is waiting to correct you or reinterpret your words. I noticed it most at night. The ventilator hummed steadily beside my bed, its sound no longer sharp with fear. I didn't check the outlet 3 times before sleeping. I didn't lie awake listening for footsteps. I trusted the quiet because it had been returned to me, not because I was forcing myself to believe in it. Once I heard my sister speaking on the phone in the other room. Her voice was tight, controlled. I didn't listen long enough to catch the words. I didn't need to. Whatever story she was telling now, it wasn't about managing me. The will remained unchanged, just as the judge had stated. No revisions, no sudden generosity or punishment. Everything stayed exactly as it had been before my illness made me convenient to redefine. That, too, was a consequence. Not the loss of something imagined, but the confirmation that nothing had ever belonged to her to begin with. I realized then that revenge didn't always look like victory parades or public shaming. Sometimes it looked like boundaries enforced so thoroughly that no one dared test them again. Sometimes it looked like being left alone. For the first time since I had come back to that house, I felt like my presence wasn't a problem to be solved. I was no longer a discussion topic. I was a person again. And as quiet settled into the spaces my sister used to fill with certainty, I understood something that surprised me with its simplicity. I hadn't taken anything from her. I had only stopped giving her access to me. That was the consequence she hadn't planned for, and it was the one she would never be able to undo. Silence changed shape after that. It no longer pressed against me like something heavy I had to carry. It opened instead, wide and deliberate, a space I could step into without fear of being misunderstood. In the weeks after the hearing, life slowed in a way that felt unfamiliar, almost suspicious at first. My days became quieter, but not emptier. Medical appointments were scheduled directly with me. Questions were asked to my face. Explanations were given without condescension. Decisions were framed as choices, not risks to be managed. I noticed how quickly my body responded to that shift, how tension I hadn't realized I was holding began to loosen. At night, I slept longer. The ventilator's steady rhythm faded into the background where it belonged. I stopped waking to check the outlet. I stopped bracing myself for the sound of footsteps outside my door. The silence in the house no longer signaled danger. It simply meant no one was interfering. That difference mattered more than I expected. My family adjusted around me, awkwardly at first. Conversations took on a careful tone, as if everyone were learning a new language they didn't quite trust yet. My parents asked instead of told. They waited for answers instead of filling the space themselves. It wasn't warmth, but it was respect. My sister stayed distant. She moved through the house like someone passing through a place she no longer recognized. When our paths crossed, there were no confrontations, no apologies. She didn't try to explain herself or soften what had happened. She didn't need to. The absence of her voice, once so constant and authoritative, was louder than any argument could have been. Once she asked if we could talk. The request came out of nowhere, delivered in a neutral tone, as if she were asking about the weather. She said it might be good to clear the air, to move on. I looked at her and felt nothing sharp rise inside me. No anger, no urge to correct her version of events. No need to revisit the past. I told her I wasn't interested. Not cruelly, not defensively, just plainly. She stood there for a moment longer, as if waiting for something else, then nodded and walked away. She didn't ask again. That was when I understood the difference between silence as surrender and silence as choice. Before, I had been quiet because speaking cost too much. Every word had been twisted, weighed, used to build a case against me. Now, I was quiet because I no longer needed to justify my reality. The truth had already done its work. I didn't replay the hearing in my mind anymore. I didn't rehearse arguments I wished I'd made. The need to be understood by people who had chosen not to listen had evaporated. That was a kind of healing I hadn't known to hope for. One afternoon, I caught my reflection in the bathroom mirror and barely recognized the person looking back. Not because I looked stronger or healthier in any obvious way, but because my expression was settled, unguarded. I wasn't scanning for reactions, anticipating corrections. I was simply there. I realized then how much of my life had been shaped by the expectation of interruption. Someone stepping in to reinterpret my needs. Someone smoothing over my discomfort for the sake of peace. Someone deciding that my quiet meant consent. That expectation was gone. I no longer explained myself preemptively. I didn't soften my words to make them easier to accept. I didn't volunteer reassurance where none was owed. When my parents asked how I was feeling, I answered honestly and stopped there. I didn't pad the truth. I didn't manage their reactions. They handled it. The ventilator continued to hum beside my bed each night, faithful and unremarkable. I thought often about that night when it had gone silent, how close I had come to losing more than breath. Not my life, perhaps, but my agency, my credibility, my place in my own story. I didn't dwell on it with fear anymore. I held it like a marker, a line I had crossed and would never approach the same way again. I didn't forgive my sister, but I didn't carry her actions with me either. There was a difference, and it mattered. Forgiveness would have required me to absolve her of what she had done. Letting go simply meant refusing to let it define what came next. I didn't need reconciliation to move forward. I needed distance, clarity, and the right to choose where my energy went. Those were mine now. One night, as I turned off the light and settled into bed, I realized I hadn't thought about protecting myself all day. I hadn't rehearsed conversations or planned contingencies. I hadn't measured my words, I had lived. That was the quiet power no one had prepared me for. Not the ability to speak louder or fight harder or prove myself more convincingly, but the freedom to stop performing altogether. As the room darkened and the machine breathed steadily beside me, I understood something with absolute certainty. Silence had stopped being a gap others could fill. It had become a boundary. And within it, I was finally whole. The quiet that followed wasn't empty. It was intentional. I noticed it one evening as I sat alone, the house settled into its familiar nighttime stillness. The ventilator breathed beside me, steady and unremarkable like a background truth that didn't need defending. I wasn't bracing for anything. I wasn't listening for footsteps. I wasn't rehearsing explanations in my head. I was simply there. For a long time, I had believed silence meant losing. Losing an argument, losing credibility, losing space to someone louder, faster, more certain. Silence had been what happened when my voice was pushed aside or twisted into something unrecognizable. But this was different. This silence belonged to me. I thought about how the story would sound if someone else told it. The sister who claimed concern. The parents who wanted peace. The accident that wasn't an accident. The hearing where everything shifted without a single raised voice. It would be easy to frame it as revenge, to say the tables turned and justice landed hard where it should have. And maybe that was true in a practical sense. Authority was removed, boundaries were enforced, control changed hands. But that wasn't what stayed with me. What stayed was the moment I realized I no longer needed to explain myself to survive. The night my ventilator went silent had taught me how quickly a person's reality could be dismissed when it became inconvenient. How easily concern could turn into manipulation. How family could become a courtroom long before any judge ever appeared. The hearing didn't give me my power back. It confirmed that it had always been mine. After everything ended, people expected a reaction, relief, anger, some kind of visible transformation. But what they got was restraint. A steady return to myself that didn't require witnesses. My sister never apologized. She didn't have to. The outcome spoke clearly enough. The absence of her authority said more than any admission could have. My parents learned quietly that silence doesn't mean agreement, that peace built on erasing someone else eventually collapses under its own weight. We found a new way to exist around each other. Not close, not distant, but honest in a way we hadn't been before. I stopped trying to repair things that weren't broken by me. I stopped narrating my pain so it would be taken seriously. I stopped waiting for permission to trust my own memory. In the weeks that followed, I returned to ordinary life. Appointments, mornings, evenings that ended without fear. None of it felt dramatic. That was the point. Stability didn't need applause. Sometimes I thought about the women who would hear this story and recognize themselves in it. The ones who had been told they were too sensitive, too difficult, too sick, too quiet to be taken seriously. The ones who had learned to doubt their own experiences because doing so kept the peace. I wanted them to know something I learned too late to save myself that night, but early enough to save everything after. Silence is not weakness when it's chosen. Silence can be a boundary, a pause that lets the truth arrive without interference. A refusal to perform pain for people who benefit from misunderstanding it. Revenge doesn't always look like shouting or humiliation. Sometimes it looks like walking away with your autonomy intact. Sometimes it looks like being believed without having to beg. Sometimes it looks like sleeping through the night. On my last evening in that house, before I moved back into a place of my own, I packed quietly. No one hovered, no one offered advice. When I carried my bag to the door, my mother asked if I needed help. I said no. She nodded and stepped aside. As I left, I didn't feel victorious. I felt complete. There was a difference. Victory depends on opposition. Completion doesn't. I didn't win by speaking louder than my sister. I won by no longer needing to speak at all. If you're listening to this and something in it feels familiar, if you've ever been dismissed when you were most vulnerable, or told that your silence meant consent, I want you to know you're not imagining it. And you're not alone. If you feel comfortable, share a word or a line in the comments. You don't have to explain anything. Sometimes simply being seen by others who understand is enough. And if stories like this matter to you, if you want to stay with a place where quiet strength and truth still count, I hope you'll stay here with me. Subscribe, come back, and listen when you need to be reminded that your voice doesn't have to be loud to be real. I didn't reclaim my life by raising my voice. I reclaimed it by choosing when to be silent. And for the first time, that silence was mine.